In this, our final video on Jane Eyre, we are going to be looking at the way that first Rochester and then St. John attempt to assault the integrity of Jane's personality. Jane has, as we have talked about in the past, two sides to her personality. She has the passionate interior, and then she also has the controlled, self-restrained exterior. Both are essential to her personality, and the integrity of her personality depends upon her ability to maintain both sides of it. Rochester attempts to eliminate the self-restrained portion of her personality and to free the caged bird inside, as he himself says, because he wants to turn her into something that she sees she is not. That is Jane Rochester, as he describes it. And in order to do that, he is going to wage an assault on that self-restraint. First, by attempting to dress her up, as Jane says, as a jay in borrowed plumes. And then later, by getting her to run off with him as his mistress. And both of these things Jane recognizes would be destructive. They would be destructive to Jane herself, whose personal integrity will be destroyed, something she holds very dear. But also they will destroy Rochester's regard for Jane. Jane recognizes that should Jane surrender her self-control, surrender her beliefs in what is right, and become his mistress, Rochester will one day hate her the same way that he hates his past mistresses. On the other hand, St. John Rivers wants Jane to become his helpmeet, the woman upon whom he can rely to serve as his missionary assistant. And in order for her to do that effectively, she has to double down on her self-restraint. She has to become as self-controlled and as self-restrained as he is, because he doesn't care about her interior life. All he cares about is her self-controlled demeanor on the exterior. And Jane recognizes that this is the mirror image of the assault that Rochester had already attempted, because in this case, St. John will be killing the interior life, without which Jane cannot live. So Jane has to survive both of these mirror assaults on her personality, the first from Rochester and the second from St. John, and is able only to achieve the kind of life she imagines for herself in a resolution that I think is extremely telling, because it is literally a deus ex machina. It is a resolution sent down from some supernatural realm, by which Jane hears Rochester magically appeal for her to return, and comes back to find that Rochester has been symbolically emasculated so that Jane can take ascendancy in their relationship. The only way that Jane can maintain her integrity is by some supernatural resolution, because in the real world, no woman would be able to achieve, through normal, ordinary means, the kinds of power and self-control and autonomy that Jane longs for and needs in order to survive. The first threat that Jane has to encounter is Rochester's attempt to free her passionate inner self, to eliminate the constraint that Jane has constructed to protect herself. As Rochester had said earlier in their initial conversations, back on page 52 and 53, I see at intervals the glance of a curious sort of bird through the close-set bars of a cage. A vivid, restless, resolute captive is there. Were it but free, it would soar cloud high. And so Rochester's goal is going to be to free this caged bird, unaware that Jane sees this as an assault on her personality. On page 98, we find the first interview between Jane and Rochester after she has accepted his proposal, and the first attempt to turn Jane Eyre into Jane Rochester, which we know now can never happen, at least legally. It is Jane Eyre, sir. Soon to be Jane Rochester, he added. In 4 weeks, Janet, not a day more. Do you hear that? I did, and I could not quite comprehend it. It made me giddy. The feeling the announcement sent through me was something stronger than was consistent with joy, something that smote and stunned. It was, I think, almost fear. So Jane's immediate response to becoming something other than she is one of fear and discomfort. You blushed, and you are now white, Jane. What is that for? Because you gave me a new name, Jane Rochester, and it seems so strange. Yes, Mrs. Rochester, said he, young Mrs. Rochester, Fairfax Rochester's girl bride. And I'm going to skip down just a little bit. To imagine such a lot befalling me is a fairy tale, a daydream. which I can and will realize. I shall begin today. This morning I wrote to my banker in London to send me certain jewels he has in his keeping, heirlooms for the ladies of Thornfield. In a day or two I hope to pour them into your lap, for every privilege, every attention shall be yours that I would accord to a peer's daughter if about to marry her. Oh, sir, never mind jewels. I don't like to hear them spoken of. Jewels for Jane Eyre sounds unnatural and strange. I would rather not have them. I will myself put the diamond chain round your neck, and the circlet on your forehead, which it will become, for nature at least has stamped her patent of nobility on this brow, Jane, and I will clasp the bracelets on these fine wrists, and load these fairy-like fingers with rings. No, no, sir, think of other subjects, and speak of other things, and in another strain. Don't address me as if I were a beauty. I am your plain Quakerish governess. You are a beauty in my eyes, and a beauty just after the desire of my heart, delicate and aerial. Puny and insignificant, you mean. You are dreaming, sir, or you are sneering. For God's sake, don't be ironical. I will make the world acknowledge you a beauty, too, he went on, while I really became uneasy at the strain he had adopted, because I felt he was either deluding himself or trying to delude me. I will attire my Jane in satin and lace, and she shall have roses in her hair, and I will cover the head I love best with a priceless veil. And then you won't know me, sir. I shall not be your Jane Eyre any longer, but an ape in a harlequin's jacket, a jay in borrowed plumes. I would as soon see you, Mr. Rochester, tricked out in stage trappings as myself clad in a court lady's robe. And I don't call you handsome, sir, though I love you most dearly, far too dearly to flatter you. Don't flatter me. So Jane is doing her best at this point to preserve the integrity of her whole character. She says she is not a beauty. She is his plain Quakerish governess. And she says that were he to decorate her with jewels and satin as he proposes, she would be an ape in a harlequin's jacket, a jay in borrowed plumes. Jays are birds that are supposed to find the feathers of other birds and stick them into their wings and tail as decorations. So Rochester is trying to turn her into something that she feels she isn't, to free the inner Jane that he feels is so important. But Jane wants to preserve her plain Quakerish exterior, and this theme is repeated over and over throughout the next few chapters. I am not an angel, I asserted, and I will not be one till I die. I will be myself, Mr. Rochester, and you must neither expect nor exact anything celestial of me, for you will not get it any more than I shall get it of you, which I do not at all anticipate. And then in the next column, don't send for the jewels and don't crown me with roses. You might as well put a border of gold lace around that plain pocket handkerchief you have there. And just as a quick aside, on the next page, page 100, we get Rochester's admission that he had brought Blanche Ingram to Thornfield in order to manipulate Jane into admitting her love for him. Well, I feigned courtship of Miss Ingram because I wished to render you as madly in love with me as I was with you, and I knew jealousy would be the best ally I could call in the furtherance of that end. On page 102, Rochester's attempt to dress Jane up continues. Glad was I to get him out of the silk warehouse and then out of a jeweler's shop. The more he bought me, the more my cheek burned with a sense of annoyance and degradation. As we re-entered the carriage and I sat back, feverish and fagged, I remembered what, in the hurry of events dark and bright, I had wholly forgotten. The letter of my uncle, John Eyre, to Mrs. Reed, his intention to adopt me and make me his legatee. It would indeed be a relief, I thought, if I had ever so small an independency. I can never bear being dressed like a doll by Mr. Rochester, or sitting like a second Danae with a golden shower falling daily around me. I will write to Madeira the moment I get home and tell my Uncle John I am going to be married and to whom. If I had but a prospect of one day bringing Mr. Rochester an accession of fortune, I could better endure to be kept by him now. And somewhat relieved by this idea, which I failed not to execute that day, I ventured once more to meet my master's and lover's eye, which most pertinaciously sought mine, though I averted both face and gaze. So Jane is trying to preserve her autonomy, her self-control, by maintaining what she says is an independency, by which she means money that it belongs to her alone, which is very important to her because it allows her to maintain her autonomy rather than becoming a slave in possession to Rochester. She is worried that by becoming a slave in possession to Rochester, she will cease to be the woman that he loves. He smiled, and I thought his smile was such as a sultan might, in a blissful and fond moment, bestow on a slave his gold and gems had enriched. I crushed his hand, which was ever hunting mine vigorously, and thrust it back to him red with a passionate pressure. "You need not look in that way," I said. "If you do, I will wear nothing but my old Lowood frocks to the end of the chapter. I'll be married in this lilac gingham. You may make a dressing gown for yourself out of the pearl gray silk, and an infinite series of waistcoats out of the black satin." He chuckled. He rubbed his hands. "Oh, is it rich to see and hear her?" he exclaimed. "Is she original? Is she piquant? I would not exchange this one little English girl for the Grand Turk's whole seraglio, gazelle eyes, hoary forms, and all." The Eastern allusion bit me again. "I'll not stand you an inch in the stead of a seraglio," I said, "so don't consider me an equivalent for one. If you have a fancy for anything in that line, away with you, sir, to the bazaars of Stamboul without delay, and lay out in extensive slave purchases some of that spare cash you seem at loss to spend satisfactorily here." There are two things that concern Jane. The first one is that he is going to try to dress her up, make her fancy, and also he is going to attempt to deprive her of her autonomy and independence by turning her into a slave or a possession, both of which would threaten her integrity of self. Jane knows that by losing that integrity, she could also lose Rochester's regard. "Do you remember what you said of Solène Varennes, of the diamonds, of the cashmeres you gave her? I will not be your English Solène Varennes. I shall continue to act as Adèle's governess. By that I shall earn my board and lodging, and £30 a year besides. I'll furnish my own wardrobe out of that money, and you shall give me nothing but—" "Well, but what?" "Your regard, and if I give you mine in return, that debt will be quit." For Jane, it's very important that she not become his English Solène Varennes, his mistress and possession, which would deprive her of the autonomy, the balance of character that she thinks is so important and that Rochester prizes in her. Part of her method for protecting her autonomy for the time being is to discourage his romantic advances, which seek to turn her into something she feels she is not. On page 104, Rochester is getting all fired up and romantic, and rather than acknowledging and accepting such treatment, Jane refuses to be placed in the role of his romantic beloved. The system thus entered on I pursued during the whole season of probation, and with the best success. He was kept, to be sure, rather cross and crusty, but on the whole I could see he was excellently entertained, and that a lamb-like submission and turtle-dove sensibility, while fostering his despotism more, would have pleased his judgment, satisfied his common sense, and even suited his taste less. Jane recognizes that what Rochester loves is the combination of her independence, self-control, and her passionate interior, and that giving up the independence and self-control and becoming his English Solène Varennes and becoming only the passionate, uncontrolled, unconstrained person would diminish his regard for her. That a lamb-like submission and turtle-dove sensibility, while fostering his despotism, would have pleased his judgment less, satisfied his common sense, and even suited his taste less. She recognizes that she can't be his slave or possession, and that he doesn't want her to. Back on page 102, Jane had come up with an idea to guarantee her independence, which is to follow through on something she had learned when she had visited her Aunt Reed as an adult, which is that she has an Uncle John who lives in Madeira, who is reasonably wealthy and is looking for Jane in order to make her the recipient of his estate when he dies. And she determines that she is going to write to her Uncle John, let him know that she's alive, and perhaps be able to establish some economic independency. What she doesn't realize when she writes to her Uncle John and tells him that she is going to be married and to whom, is she is setting off a chain of events that is going to prevent her marriage. Because Uncle John, who lives in Madeira, lives in the same place where Bertha Mason's family comes from, and they move in the same circles. And when her uncle shares with friends in Madeira that Jane is about to be married to a man named Edward Rochester, he alerts the Mason family that their son-in-law, who is still married to their daughter, is about to marry someone else, and send a representative, a lawyer, to their wedding. Before the wedding, however, on page 108, Jane gets a visit at night from Bertha, which she suspects is a dream, but we know is actually real. And what's interesting is the way that Jane describes Bertha. She believes that Bertha is a vampire who tries on Jane's veil the night before Jane's wedding, clearly once again marking Bertha as Jane's double in the novel. Fiercely and ghastly to me, oh sir, I never saw a face like it. It was a discolored face. It was a savage face. I wish I could forget the roll of the red eyes and the fearful blackened inflation of the lineaments. Ghosts are usually pale, Jane. This, sir, was purple. The lips were swelled and dark, the brow furrowed, the black eyebrows widely raised over the bloodshot eyes. Shall I tell you of what it reminded me? You may. Of the foul German spectre, the vampire. It's worth considering at this point that Jane's representation of Bertha Mason echoes the patriarchal image of women's sexuality, which represents a threat to the patriarchy. It reminds me of the passage from Virginia Woolf's essay, Professions for Women, in which she describes the problems faced by a woman who tries to be honest in expressing her passions when she writes. She had thought of something about the body, about the passions, which it was unfitting for her as a woman to say. Men, her reason told her, would be shocked. The consciousness of what men will say of a woman who speaks the truth about her passions had roused her from her artist's state of unconsciousness. She could write no more. For though men sensibly allow themselves great freedom in these respects, I doubt they realize or can control the extreme severity with which they condemn such freedom in women. Jane's characterization of Bertha as foul, evil, and disfigured reflects the patriarchal image of women's sexuality because it has been argued that women's sexuality threatens the patriarchy. In a patriarchal, patrilineal society, power and property are passed on from father to son. And the only way one can guarantee that one is passing on one's property and name to someone who shares one's genetic ability to manage that properly effectively is to make sure that one's son is one's own. That is, that one's son inherits one's genetic makeup. And the only way one can do that is to make sure that no one else gets to one's women. If you think of the traditional Anglo-European Western ceremony, the bride is expected to wear white, which is a symbolic proof that she is indeed pure. And the bride is handed from the father to the husband at the ceremony. In the traditional ceremony, the priest or minister asks, "Who gives this woman to be married to this man?" And the father says, "I do," which shows that this is a transmission of property. The father is passing on his property to her new owner, the husband. And the white dress is a symbol of a guarantee that no other man has gotten to her, and therefore any progeny that are begot through this woman will be the genetic copies of the man who fathers them. In such a society, a woman who expresses her own individuality is a threat to the stability of the patriarchy. And this concept of women's sexuality as a threat to the patriarchy is reflected in the description of Bertha, whom we will understand later from Rochester's description is unchaste and intemperate. And therefore her monstrosity is a reflection of the way that the patriarchal culture regards her free expression of sexuality. It's worth noting, and we'll be discussing later, that Rochester admits to having 3 separate mistresses and is the patron of a ward who may or may not be his illegitimate daughter, and yet no one has locked him up for intemperateness or monstrous propensities. Ah, what did it do? Sir, it removed my veil from its gaunt head, rent it in 2 parts, and flinging both on the floor, trampled on them. Bertha is the external manifestation of the passionate Jane, what she could be if she were unable to maintain her self-control. And it's possible that tearing this veil in half and flinging them on the floor is symbolically representative not only of the disruption of Jane's wedding, but also of Jane's personality being split in half as a result of the wedding. Because once the wedding goes forward, Jane will not be married because Rochester is already married to Bertha. So Rochester will be a bigamist and Jane will be a corrupted, unmarried woman who has engaged in a relationship with a man she cannot marry and cannot be with, which would ruin her. So Jane will, in effect, by marrying Rochester, become the thing she fears to be. On page 109, during the marriage ceremony, at the moment when the minister asks, "Does anyone know of an impediment which can prevent the marriage of this man and this woman?" the lawyer, Mr. Wood, for the Masons, steps forward and says, "The marriage cannot go on. I declare the existence of an impediment, and that impediment is that Rochester is already married to Bertha Mason." And at this point, the truth comes out. It's important to keep in mind that Rochester's attempt to marry Jane is actually a selfish assault on her because he cannot marry her. He won't be married to her. But she, believing that she is married, will engage in the activities that are normal between a husband and a wife, in other words, sex. But she will be having sex with a man who is not and cannot be her husband, which will mean that she can't stay with Rochester, and she won't be able to marry anyone else because a ruined woman, as she would be described, is not appropriate marriage material. A woman who has engaged in sexual behavior with a man who is not her husband is ruined and will not be marriageable. And further, she will not be employable because certainly no one would hire as the governess for their small children a woman who has, whether she did it willingly and knowingly or not, engaged in such behavior. So Rochester's attempt to marry Jane is actually an assault on her, an attempt to ruin her. It's not just a benevolent deception. Jane's response to this, of course, is that she must flee Thornfield. And so this is the point where we see Jane's self-disciplined, self-controlled exterior, the judgment, conscience, and rationality overcome the passion. And we'll see the battle between the two of her take place in her interview with Rochester after she discovers the truth. At the beginning of Volume 3, the third volume of the three-volume set, in chapter 27, we see Jane begin this battle between the passionate interior and the self-controlled, self-disciplined exterior. And this is on page 113. That I am not Edward Rochester's bride is the least part of my woe, I alleged. That I have awakened out of the most glorious dreams and found them all void and vain as a horror I could bear and master. But that I must leave him decidedly, instantly, entirely is intolerable. I cannot do it. But then a voice within me averred that I could do it, and foretold that I should do it. I wrestled with my own resolution. I wanted to be weak that I might avoid the awful passage of further suffering I saw laid out for me. And conscience, turned tyrant, held passion by the throat. Told her tauntingly she had yet but dipped her dainty foot in the slough, and swore that with arm of iron he would thrust her down to the unsounded depths of agony. Let me be torn away then, I cried. Let another help me. No, you shall tear yourself away. None shall help you. You shall yourself pluck out your right eye, yourself cut off your right hand. Your heart shall be the victim, and you the priest to transfix it. So Jane is having this conflict between her internal passionate self that wants to be Rochester's bride or his mistress at any cost, the passion, and her conscience, which will tear her away. Your heart shall be the victim, and you the priest to transfix it. So this is the battle between Jane's passionate interior and her self-controlled resolution. Earlier, on page 105, she had aligned her internal self with her love of Rochester. She had said, "He stood between me and every thought of religion, as an eclipse intervenes between man and the broad sun. I could not in those days see God for his creature, of whom I had made an idol." So her interior id longs for Rochester. It's her exterior self-control and self-discipline that maintains her control and denies herself the gratification of being with Rochester. Later in the same chapter comes the interview between Rochester and Jane, during which Jane learns about what has been going on this whole time. This is the piece of information that Jane has not had that would have made sense of the whole previous volume. In this section, Rochester explains to Jane about his history with Bertha and also explains his plans for Jane and Rochester, which is that she will run off with him to Europe where no one knows them and where they can live as man and wife, though not actually married. And this is the point in the novel in which Jane must assert her self-control in order to protect her integrity. Also in this scene is a very important passage where Jane uses her self-control, her emotional self-discipline, as a way of protecting herself from Rochester by manipulating Rochester. All along in this novel, there has been a contest between Rochester's attempt to get to Jane and Jane's use of her self-discipline and self-control to fight him off. We saw that in the earlier chapter where he was attempting to woo her with romantic music and descriptions of their romantic relationship, and she fought him off and controlled him with her own self-discipline. And now we'll see this in an extreme version where Rochester actually threatens violence Rochester has just been explaining his history with Bertha and is now turning to the relationship between himself and Jane. "Jane, will you hear reason?" He stooped and approached his lips to my ear. "Because if you won't, I'll try violence." His voice was hoarse, his look that of a man who is just about to burst an insufferable bond and plunge headlong into wild license. I saw that in another moment, and with one impetus of frenzy more, I should be able to do nothing with him. The present, the passing second of time was all I had in which to control and restrain him. A movement of repulsion, flight, fear would have sealed my doom and his. So she recognizes at this moment she is in extreme danger of him passing an insufferable bond and plunging headlong into wild license, which would have sealed her doom and his. In other words, he would attack her and take her by violence. But Jane sees this as a challenge to her self-control and self-discipline, as a way of controlling Rochester. But I was not afraid, not in the least. I felt an inward power, a sense of influence which supported me. The crisis was perilous, but not without its charm, such as the Indian perhaps feels when he slips over the rapid in his canoe. I took hold of his clenched hand, loosened the contorted fingers, and said to him soothingly, so Jane is controlling her fear, and through the power of controlling herself, she's now going to control him. "Sit down, I will talk to you as long as you like, and hear all you have to say, whether reasonable or unreasonable." He sat down, but he did not get leave to speak directly. I had been struggling with tears for some time. I had taken great pains to repress them, because I knew he would not like to see me weep. Now, however, I considered it well to let them flow as freely and as long as they liked. If the flood annoyed him, so much the better. So I gave way and cried heartily. Look at what's going on here. She feels an inward power, a sense of influence, and that power and influence comes from controlling herself. He did not get leave to speak directly. In other words, she did not give him permission to speak because she is going to use her self-control to control how he behaves. I had been struggling with tears for some time. I had taken great pains to repress them. So she's repressing her emotions. Now, however, I considered it well to let them flow as freely and long as they liked. So in other words, she's thinking about it. Okay, so I feel like I need to cry, but I really don't want to cry right now, so I'm going to control that. Okay, so now crying would be a useful strategic move. I'm going to use crying as a tactical weapon in this circumstance. I'm going to deploy my tears. And so it is well to let them flow, to deploy her tears. So I gave way and cried heartily. Soon I heard him earnestly entreating me to be composed. I said I could not while he was in such a passion. "But I am not angry, Jane. I only love you too well. And you had steeled your little pale face with such a resolute frozen look I could not endure it. Hush now and wipe your eyes." His softened voice announced that he was subdued, so I, in my turn, became calm. Now he made an effort to rest his head on my shoulder, but I would not permit it. So he was subdued by her use of passion, by her tactical deployment of her tears. As a result of her successfully subjecting him to her control, she becomes calm, but when he tries to engage in some sort of affectionate gesture, I would not permit it. So Jane's control of herself here is a way that she manages to not only control herself, but use her self-control to control Rochester as well. During the next few pages, Rochester attempts to explain his history to Jane and also to persuade her that he and she should elope to Europe where they can live as man and wife, but she would in effect be his mistress. And during this conversation, he reveals to her what is wrong with Bertha, and it makes it clear again that Bertha is the double of Jane, what Jane would be were she to give up her self-control and indulge in her passionate nature. I lived with that woman upstairs 4 years, and before that time she had tried me indeed. Her character ripened and developed with frightful rapidity. Her vices sprang up fast and rank. They were so strong only cruelty would check them, and I would not use cruelty. What a pygmy intellect she had, and what giant propensities. How fearful were the curses those propensities entailed on me. Bertha Mason, the true daughter of an infamous mother, dragged me through all the hideous and degrading agonies which must attend a man bound to a wife at once intemperate and unchaste. Now this is Victorian shorthand for a woman who is unable to contain her giant propensities and her lack of temperate behavior. She is at once intemperate and unchaste. Of course, in Victorian culture, we don't talk about sex. Sex doesn't exist. But there are careful codes that one can use in order to describe sexual behavior, and these are them. Bertha Mason's problem is that she gives in to her desires and her passions without control and is therefore subject to giant propensities and intemperate and unchaste. This is the extreme image of what Jane would be were she to give in to her desires and run away as Rochester's mistress. And Jane recognizes that by doing that, she would destroy not only herself, but her relationship with Rochester. On page 119, Rochester describes his relationship with his previous mistresses. And just as an aside, one cannot avoid noting the irony that he has openly kept several mistresses, and yet he is still able to function in society. But were Jane to engage in an out-of-marriage relationship with Rochester, she would be ruined. So there's the Victorian double standard in action. Hiring a mistress is the next worst thing to buying a slave. Remember that earlier he had described her as a member of his seraglio, a harem, which is a group of slave wives. Both are often by nature and always by position inferior, and to live familiarly with inferiors is degrading. I now hate the recollection of the time I passed with Selene, Giacinta, and Clara, his French, Spanish, and German mistresses. He is nothing if not multinational. And then Jane draws, of course, the obvious conclusion from that, which is that she cannot be their successor. I felt the truth of these words, and I drew from them the certain inference that if I were so far to forget myself and all the teachings that had ever been instilled in me, as under any pretext, with any justification, through any temptation, to become the successor of these poor girls, he would one day regard me with the same feeling which now in his mind desecrated their memory. I did not give utterance to this conviction. It was enough to feel it. I impressed it on my heart that it might remain there to serve me as aid in the time of trial. In the next few pages, Rochester describes his attempts to understand Jane, which includes, "The next day I observed you, myself unseen, for half an hour while you played with Adele in the gallery. It was a snowy day, I recollect, and you could not go out of doors. I was in my room, the door was ajar, I could both listen and watch." And so he admits, of course, to spying on her and tells her that he had had a peephole in one of the walls through which he watched her with Adele. On page 21, the struggle between Rochester and Jane, but more importantly between Jane's desire and her self-control, come to a head, reach a climax. Rochester is now demanding that she consent to live as his mistress, and Jane's self-control speaks up. "Still indomitable," was the reply. "I care for myself. The more solitary, the more friendless, the more unsustained I am, the more I will respect myself. I will keep the law given by God, sanctioned by man." So we can hear here clearly the echoes of the lesson that she learned from Helen Burns earlier, that maintaining one's self-control and one's respect for oneself and also maintaining control of oneself is more important than giving in to the need to have relationships with others. And it's interesting that it comes up in this controversy between her insane desires and her sane self-control. "I will hold to the principles received by me when I was sane and not mad as I am now." It's an interesting form of madness that recognizes its madness and refuses to give in to it. "Laws and principles are not for the times when there is no temptation. They are for such moments as this, when body and soul rise in mutiny against their rigor. Stringent are they, inviolate they shall be." So pay careful attention to the fact that on one hand we have body and soul rising in mutiny against the rigor of laws, which is her self-control. She has this conflict inside, this mutiny between her sane self and her mad self. And once again in Jane Eyre, you cannot encounter the word madness without thinking immediately of Bertha Mason and Jane's alternative fate if she gives in to it. "If at my individual convenience I might break them, what would be their worth? They have a worth, so I have always believed. And if I cannot believe it now, it is because I am insane, quite insane, with my veins running fire and my heart beating faster than I can count its throbs. Preconceived opinions, foregone determination are all I have at this hour to stand by. There I plant my foot." I did. Mr. Rochester, reading my countenance, saw I had done so. His fury was wrought to the highest. He must yield to it for a moment, whatever followed. He crossed the floor and seized my arm and grasped my waist. He seemed to devour me with his flaming glance. Physically, I felt at the moment powerless as stubble exposed to the draft and glow of a furnace. Mentally, I still possessed my soul, and with it the certainty of ultimate safety. So once again, there's the echo, because she is insane, the insane portion of her that desires, with her veins running fire. And on the other hand, there is her determination, there I plant my foot. And Rochester, once again, reading my countenance. There we have Rochester looking through and seeing what's going on inside, responds. And her self-control, once again, is the thing that saves her. Never, said he as he ground his teeth, never was anything at once so frail and so indomitable. A mere reed she feels in my hand, and he shook me with the force of his hold. I could bend her with my finger and thumb. And what good would it do if I bent, if I tore, if I crushed her? Consider that eye. Consider the resolute, wild, free thing looking out of it, defying me with more than courage, with a stern triumph. Whatever I do with its cage, I cannot get at it, the savage, beautiful creature. If I tear, if I rend the slight prison, my outrage will only let the captive loose. Conqueror I might be of the house, but the inmate would escape to heaven before I could call myself possessor of its clay dwelling place. And it is you, spirit, with will and energy and virtue and purity that I want, not alone your brittle frame. Of yourself you could come with soft flight and nestle against my heart if you would. Seized against your will, you will elude the grasp like an essence. You will vanish ere I inhale your fragrance. Oh, come, Jane, come. But of course, Jane can't consent to this, and flees Rochester in the dead of night in order to preserve her integrity. After a harrowing journey in which Jane manages to lose her suitcase on the coach and almost dies of starvation and exposure, she manages by sheer luck to come to the house of a minister who turns out to be St. John Rivers. Though we don't know it yet, St. John, Mary, and Diane Rivers are her cousins, and they share a common ancestor, John Eyre. All these four are the heirs of John Eyre. St. John Rivers represents the complementary opposite threat, the mirror threat to Jane that Rochester represented. St. John, like Jane, has a very passionate interior. Also, St. John, like Jane, has a very strong sense of self-discipline. St. John's passion is much stronger than Jane's, but his self-discipline is much stronger. And the self-discipline side of St. John is what represents the threat to Jane. Just as Rochester had sought to free the passionate interior, which would lead to Jane's destruction, she felt, St. John seeks to impose a stronger self-discipline on Jane, which will also lead to her destruction. On page 134, in chapter 30, Jane describes St. John's character, which is revealed during his sermon. And by the way, it's important to pay attention in this section of the novel as well. St. John's and Jane's attempt to read each other by reading their expression. St. John is trying to figure out who Jane is, similar to the way that Rochester had tried to figure her out through studying before, and he tests her the same way that Rochester had subjected her to a series of tests in order to discover her character, and he seeks to read her countenance, to read her face, to find her personality through her features, just as Rochester had done. At the same time, Jane is trying to read St. John. But in some ways, St. John represents a more serious threat because St. John's self-discipline is the part of Jane that she needs to maintain, and that's the part he wants to accentuate. In chapter 30, on page 134, Jane describes his sermon, which is a means that Jane uses to understand his character. It began calm, and indeed, as far as delivery and pitch of voice went, it was calm to the end. An earnestly felt yet strictly restrained zeal breathed soon in the distinct accents and prompted the nervous language. And so we have an earnestly felt yet strictly restrained zeal. So a passionate interior that's carefully restrained. This grew to force, compressed, condensed, controlled. The heart was thrilled, the mind astonished by the power of the preacher. Neither were softened. Throughout there was a strange bitterness, an absence of consolatory gentleness. Stern allusions to Calvinistic doctrines, election, predestination, reprobation were frequent. and each reference to these points sounded like a sentence pronounced for doom. When he had done, instead of feeling better, calmer, more enlightened by this discourse, I experienced an inexpressible sadness, for it seemed to me, I know not whether equally so to others, that the eloquence to which I had been listening had sprung from a depth where lay turbid dregs of disappointment, where moved troubling impulses of insatiate yearnings and disquieting aspirations. Jane recognizes that there are, and remember Jane's speech when she first arrived at Thornfield about her desires for broader venues. A depth where lay turbid dregs of disappointment, were troubling impulses of insatiate yearnings and disquieting aspirations. I was sure St. John Rivers, pure-lived, conscientious, zealous as he was, had not yet found that peace of God which passeth all understanding. He had no more found it, I thought, than had I, with my concealed and racking regrets for my broken idol and lost Elysium, regrets to which I had latterly avoided referring, which possessed me and tyrannized over me ruthlessly. So St. John is not only a threat to Jane's personality, but a double of her personality. Like Jane, St. John has a passionate but disappointed interior, longing for more, and also a self-controlled exterior. At the bottom of page 135 in the same chapter, I do want to call your attention to the passage where St. John interviews Jane. He looked at me before he proceeded. Indeed, he seemed leisurely to read my face, as if its features and lines were characters on a page. And there once again we have reading my face and the power of understanding someone as if they could read their characters on a page. Just as an aside regarding an important plot development, St. John describes to Jane a distant relative. He describes my uncle, who realized a fortune of 20,000 pounds. He was never married and had no near kindred but ourselves and one other person not more closely related than we. My father always cherished the idea that he would atone for his error by leaving his possessions to us. That letter informs us that he has bequeathed every penny to the other relation. And of course, we know, although St. John and Jane don't yet know, that this other relation, this one other person, not more closely related than we are, is Jane herself. We get to see a demonstration of St. John's rigid self-control when we see his relationship with Rosamond Oliver, a beautiful heiress who Jane describes as a perfect beauty and very nice young woman who deeply loves St. John, and St. John loves her back, but St. John recognizes that she cannot be his bride because she would not satisfy his needs as a missionary. We watch St. John restrain his passionate desire for Rosamond because he recognizes that she would not satisfy the need for self-discipline. Jane watches St. John watch Rosamond. As she patted the dog's head, bending with native grace before his young and austere master, I saw a glow rise to that master's face. I saw his solemn eye melt with sudden fire and flicker with resistless emotion. Flushed and kindled thus, he looked nearly as beautiful for a man as she for a woman. His chest heaved once, as if his large heart, weary of despotic constriction, had expanded despite the will, and made a vigorous bound for the attainment of liberty. But he curbed it, I think, as a resolute rider would curb a rearing steed. He responded neither by word nor movement to the gentle advances made him. Once again, St. John is clearly Jane on steroids. Jane loves Rochester, but is able to control her passion for Rochester to preserve her self-control. St. John loves Rosamond, but he's able to control his passionate desire for Rosamond in order to maintain the goal that he has set for himself. I want to call your attention to a passage on page 142 where St. John discovers who Jane actually is. And it's an interesting passage because Jane believes once again she is successfully reading the emotions of another person, but is entirely mistaken. On page 142, Jane has been drawing, and St. John bends over to watch her drawings. And it's interesting how the drawings had become an avenue into Jane's character. For Rochester earlier in the novel, they now become an avenue into Jane's identity for St. John at this point. Jane has been drawing a picture of Rosamond, and she sees St. John bend over and look at the picture of Rosamond and start, and Jane thinks it's because he is struck by the beauty of the woman he loves, but that's not in fact what's happening. While I was thus eagerly glancing at the bright pages of Marmion, for Marmion it was, St. John stooped to examine my drawing, her drawing of Rosamond. His tall figure sprang erect again with a start. He said nothing. I looked up at him. He shunned my eye. I knew his thoughts well and could read his heart plainly. At the moment I felt calmer and cooler than he. I had temporarily the advantage of him. And so Jane believes that she has gained the advantage of temporarily gained the advantage of St. John, because she has read his heart plainly in his eye, because she thinks her picture has struck him with the beauty of Rosamond. But in fact, what's really happened here is that Jane has unthinkingly doodled her actual name, Jane Eyre, in the corners of the drawing. And St. John, bending over, has seen her write her name and now realizes with surprise that the woman he has been helping is actually his cousin and the woman who inherited the £20,000 left by their uncle. Further in this scene, and this is very entertaining and reveals something about St. John's character, Jane wants to talk to St. John about Rosamond's love for him and find out why he doesn't pursue Rosamond, whose father would certainly consent to the marriage. And St. John says, as Jane is talking about how Rosamond feels about him, "It is very pleasant to hear this," he said. "Very. Go on for another quarter of an hour." And he actually took out his watch and laid it upon the table to measure the time. So he times out for 15 minutes how long they can talk about the relationship before he puts it behind him forever. On page 146, Jane finally gains the independence that she had longed for earlier when she had written to her Uncle John, which is a fortune of £20,000. £20,000 in contemporary money would be about $2.5 million. So it is a significant amount of money. But of course, she's happier not to have received the money, because £5,000 would be quite enough for her, but rather to have discovered that she has living relatives with whom she splits her inheritance. St. John, discovering Jane's self-discipline and ability to control herself and her strength of character, decides that she, rather than Rosamond, would be a better wife for him for his intended journey to India as a missionary. However, this requires that Jane sacrifice not her self-control this time as it was with Rochester, but sacrifice the other side of her personality, the passionate interior that she also values. Think back to William Blake's claim that without contraries there is no progression. Reason and energy are both essential to the human character, and Jane embodies this truth. On page 154, in what is certainly the worst proposal ever in reality or fiction from a man to a woman, "Jane, come with me to India. Come as my helpmeet and fellow laborer." The glen and sky spun around, the hills heaved. It was as if I had heard a summons from heaven, as if a visionary messenger like him of Macedonia had announced, "Come over and help us." But I was no apostle. I could not behold the herald. I could not receive his call. "O St. John," I cried, "have some mercy." I appealed to one who, in the discharge of what he believed his duty, knew neither mercy nor remorse. He continued, "God and nature intended you for a missionary's wife. It is not personal, but mental endowments they have given you. You are formed for labor, not for love. A missionary's wife you shall be. You shall be mine. I claim you, not for my pleasure, but for my sovereign service." Now, certainly this is not a romantic appeal. You are formed for labor, not for love. It is not personal, but mental endowments they have given you. You're not very good looking. Nobody is going to love you, but you're a good hard worker, and therefore you're the perfect wife for me. He says further on the next column, "Jane, you are docile, diligent, disinterested, faithful, constant, and courageous, very gentle and very heroic. Cease to mistrust yourself. I can trust you unreservedly. As a conductress of Indian schools and a helper amongst Indian women, your assistance will be to me invaluable." My iron shroud contracted round me. Persuasion advanced with a slow, sure step. And so the counterpart to Rochester's appeal to her passion is St. John's appeal to her self-discipline. But this is similarly a threat to her integrity as an individual. As St. John tells her on page 154, "I want a wife, the sole helpmeet I can influence efficiently in life and retain absolutely till death." But Jane recognizes that this is destruction for her. "Alas, if I join St. John, I abandon half myself. If I go to India, I go to premature death." Notice in this passage that there are two separate problems here. One of them, obviously, is premature death. But the other one is abandoning half myself, abandoning the passionate interior that she would have to give up if she married St. John. As she says on the next column, "And I will give the missionary my energies. It is all he wants, but not myself. That would be only adding the husk and shell to the kernel. For them he has no use. I retain them." "Oh, I will give my heart to God," I said. "You do not want it." Jane is worried that her relationship with St. John will cause the destruction of the half of her nature that drives her. Later she says, as his curate, his comrade, all would be right. I would cross oceans with him in that capacity. My body would be under a rather stringent yoke, but my heart and mind would be free. I should still have my unblighted self to turn to, my natural, unenslaved feelings with which to communicate in moments of loneliness. There would be recesses in my mind which would be only mine, to which he never came, and sentiments growing there fresh and sheltered, which his austerity could never blight, nor his measured warrior march trample down. But as his wife, at his side always, and always restrained and always checked, forced to keep the fire of my nature continually low, to compel it to burn inwardly and never utter a cry, though the imprisoned flame consumed vital after vital. This would be unendurable. And so this is the threat, that she would be always restrained and always checked, forced to keep the fire of her nature continually low, to compel it to burn inwardly and never utter a cry. So, forced to suppress her passionate interior, to let it burn out, would destroy the half of her personality that she needs and that St. John threatens. On page 158 she says, if I were to marry you would kill me. You are killing me now. Then on page 160 and 161 comes the moment where St. John is just about to win. Just as in the final scene with Rochester, her desire almost overcame her self-control and she almost consented to be his mistress. At this point, her self-control almost overcomes her desire and she almost consents to be St. John's wife. At that moment, we have the supernatural Gothic Deus Ex Machina moment where Jane mysteriously hears Rochester's voice calling to her. Now, we find out later in the novel that Rochester, in despair, had actually walked outside and called out to Jane, and somehow through a mysterious means, their souls touching through the ether, she hears his cry and decides that she must go to him. And this is what allows her to escape St. John. Just as her self-control had allowed her to escape Rochester, now the mysterious force of her passionate engagement with Rochester allows her to escape St. John's attempt to stifle her personality. Of course, when she finds Rochester hidden at Ferndean, he has now gone through the extraordinary circumstance of attempting to save his crazy wife as she burned down Thornfield. And he has, as a result, become blinded and maimed. His right hand has been damaged and he can no longer see. One eye permanently destroyed and the other one blurred by fire. At the same time, he has become free to Bertha Mason, who, after setting the fire at Thornfield, during Rochester's attempt to rescue her, throws herself from the roof and dashes her brains out on the ground below. Jane, at this point, finds a Rochester she can control, and it's an interesting method of her control because she can see and he can't. She can read his face, he can't read hers. And so at this point, she becomes the one who is dominant in the relationship, which allows her to maintain her autonomy and self-control. And not only that, she has an independent wealth and can tease Rochester with having family, because before she was a penniless orphan governess with no wealth and no family, and he was a powerful man, and now he is a weakened man, and she is an heiress with a family who can see. And so now she has gained control of their relationship. In a playful scene, but actually reveals something about the relationship, she makes it quite clear that she has control of their relationship because she knows what's going on while he does not. And when he appears to her, he doesn't even realize it's Jane at first. If you remember earlier in the novel, Rochester was the one who sought to free the caged bird, to let Jane loose. But now Jane becomes the one on page 168 who is seeking to free Rochester. His countenance reminded one of a lamp quenched, waiting to be relit, and alas, it was not himself that could now kindle the luster of animated expression. He was dependent on another for that office. I had meant to be gay and careless, but the powerlessness of the strong man touched my heart to the quick. Still I accosted him with what vivacity I could. He avows his dependence on her. And so Jane is now in control of Rochester. I love you better now when I can really be useful to you than I did in your state of proud independence when you disdained every part but that of the giver and protector. In the final chapter of the novel, of course, we get the famous line, "Reader, I married him." And then we understand the relationship between Jane that allows her to maintain her autonomy and Rochester, who has now become her dependent. For I was then his vision, as I am still his right hand. Literally I was, what he often called me, the apple of his eye. He saw nature, he saw books through me, and never did I weary of gazing for his behalf and of putting into words the effect of the field, tree, town, river, cloud, sunbeam, of the landscape before us, of the weather round us, and impressing by sound on his ear what light could no longer stamp on his eye. Never did I weary of reading to him, never did I weary of conducting him where he wished to go, of doing for him what he wished to be done. And there was pleasure in my services, most full, most exquisite, even though sad, because he claimed these services without painful shame or damping humiliation. He loved me so truly that he knew no reluctance in profiting by my attendance. He felt I loved him so fondly that to yield that attendance was to indulge my sweet wishes. And so now he becomes thoroughly dependent on Jane. And specifically in this novel, where being able to see and read is so important. And Rochester becomes dependent on Jane's ability to see and read, because he no longer has that power himself. Jane is the one who is gazing for his behalf. He sees nature, he saw books through me, for then I was his vision. If you remember earlier in chapter 12, when Jane was longing to experience wider vistas and looking for someone who would help her see the world, and then came to believe that Rochester was the person who would give her this broader view, who lets her see the bigger world. Now Jane is the person who lets Rochester see the world quite literally, of putting into words the effect of the field, tree, town, river, cloud, sunbeam, of the landscape before us, of the weather round us, and impressing by sound on his ear what light could no longer stamp on his eye. Never did I weary of reading to him. Never did I weary of conducting him where he wished to go. So Jane, although she's certainly doing it out of love, has now gained ascendancy in the relationship and is able to preserve her autonomy, her integrity, and herself by her ability to control Rochester. But as I pointed out at the beginning of this discussion, this conclusion allows Jane an autonomy that would not be available to most women, because it literally comes from a deus ex machina. It's literally God from a machine. Jane gets her happy ending in fiction, but it's a happy ending that we can contrast with the relationship most women had in this society, who were the subordinates to their husband. It wouldn't be till over 30 years later that the Married Women's Property Act of 1882 gave married women the right to own property in their own name. For women during this period, during the period when Jane is supposed to have married Rochester, when a woman marries a man, not only does her property become his, but she literally becomes his property. Jane is able to maintain her self-control and autonomy, maintain her independence, simply because the novel symbolically maims Rochester and gives Jane ascendancy in this relationship. But this is not a privilege that most women during the 19th century would enjoy.